Railway cutbacks are seldom out of the news, as the recent proposed pruning of some of the UK's less well-used lines shows only too well. It's tempting to think that not so very long ago there was a golden age of railways, when the service was far more wide-reaching, with lots of well-staffed smart country stations feeding into a super-efficient national network. Of course, the reality was very different. Britain was indeed the birthplace of railways, but it was also one of the first countries in the world to see a major programme of closures, cutting back not only the excesses of duplication between one-time rival railway companies, but also depriving many towns of their only rail connection. In the early 1960s, Dr. Beeching, in his infamous report, The Reshaping of British Railways, proposed huge cutbacks of the network, drastically pruning duplicated routes and unprofitable rural lines, though in reality a good many had already closed in the 1950s as a result of falling traffic levels and growing road competition. Scenes like this were all too common in the 1960s, as demolition contractors struggled to keep pace with the sheer number of derelict stations, goods sheds and signal boxes. The railway preservation movement had only just started, and many artefacts that would be valuable today were simply left to rot. Disused lines became a familiar feature of the landscape, waiting to be recolonised by nature or redeveloped by man. Sometimes, and against all the odds, the closure turned out to be only temporary. This attractive route to the shore of Lake Windermere in the Lake District was finally abandoned by BR in 1965, who were faced with the prohibitive costs of all-year-round maintenance for a line that was used mainly for seasonal excursion holiday traffic. However, many people felt this appealing short line's tourist potential was too great to be lost, so the volunteers got to work. Eventually, this 3-mile stretch was reopened as a heritage railway in 1973. Since then, visitors have once again been able to enjoy steam haulage to the landing stage at Lake Windermere. But for most closed lines, there is no real prospect of reopening once they've been deleted from the railway map. In rural districts, the track beds are often sold off piecemeal to farmers, and within a few years, only the old cuttings and embankments remain as reminders of former railway glory days. But it's not all doom and gloom. Many old railway track beds have found a new use as popular footpaths, often with the support of the local authority. However, even though the trains have long since departed, the substantial cost of safely maintaining large structures like bridges and viaducts still continues, which can be a heavy burden for local ratepayers. Many former railway buildings and stations also survive, in a wide variety of uses, often as attractive private houses. Halton Station, near Lancaster, has now found a very unusual new use. Tastefully converted, it's now a boat store for the rowing club at Lancaster University. 40 years ago, steam trains would have stormed through here with holiday services from Leeds to Morecambe via Lancaster Green Anne. Much of the route is now a popular cycle track, providing a traffic-free alternative to the busy A683. Fortunately, the bridges over the Crook of Lune at Caton were left in place after the line closed. The rhythm of the daily steam-hauled freight trains from Measham docks is now a distant memory, and today the only sound you're likely to hear around here are bicycles or walkers enjoying the tranquility of the Lune Valley. With the benefit of hindsight, many lines that did close would today undoubtedly serve a useful purpose, if only someone had had the foresight to mothball the track rather than completely remove every last vestige of railway infrastructure. It can be argued that it's not simply about profit. There are other matters, including environmental issues, that should be taken into account. And indeed, today's new and invigorated privatised railway does receive huge subsidies to operate some less profitable routes. But it's not by any means all bad news, as we shall see during the course of this programme. Although some famous and useful lines did indeed close, others were saved. And many other routes that were considered to have no future still function today, even if they're serving totally different customer needs. Bath Green Park Station was once the northern terminus of the Somerset and Dorset Railway, a meandering cross-country route that must always have struggled to cover its costs, even before competition from road transport began to bite. Dr. Beeching targeted the whole of the Somerset and Dorset system, and the line to Bath Green Park closed in March 1966. The Somerset and Dorset remained steam-worked until the end. These evocative scenes were recorded on New Year's Day 1966, with the train setting off on its leisurely journey to Bournemouth. The engine is a BR Standard Class 4, built in the 1950s. The crossing of the Mendip Hills between Evercreech Junction and Bath produced some delightful scenery. It also gave the line its steep gradients, sharp curves, and heavy earthworks. The combination of an ex-LMS locomotive and Southern Region Green rolling stock is a reminder that the Somerset and Dorset was a joint line up to nationalisation in 1948. Chilcompton Station was busy at least 6 times a year as the railhead for Downside Public School. It was also the loading point for one of the local collieries. To the south of Binnegar, the line wound its way up to Maysbury Summit, 811 feet above sea level, before dropping down again to Evercreech Junction, where the branch from Burnham-on-Sea joined. Although the line from Bath turned out to be the more important arm of the S&D, it was actually opened more than a decade after the line from Burnham-on-Sea. The original idea of the Somerset and Dorset had been to provide an overland link between the seaports of Poole and Burnham-on-Sea, avoiding the hazardous sea passage round the coast of Devon and Cornwall. The port-to-port traffic never lived up to expectations, but once the Bath extension had opened, the Somerset and Dorset found a new role, carrying holiday makers between the industrial north of England and the south coast, as well as tapping the freight potential of Somerset quarries and collieries. The intermediate station of Wincanton produced a mixture of passenger and goods traffic, as it was once the location of local milk processing factories. At Blandford, Bryanston School generated a periodic flurry of activity, with pupils and their trunks, which would have been sent luggage in advance. Blandford marked the start of the single-track section to Templecombe, which would have caused some congestion on busy summer Saturdays. The northbound exit was up a steep climb of 1 in 60. If only summer Saturday traffic volumes could have been maintained every day of the year, then doubtless the S&D would still survive today. But by the early 1960s, it was a classic case of an underutilised resource soaking up taxpayers' money, and with little potential for development. At Broadstone Junction, the S&D crossed the Castleman's Corkscrew, the original main line from Southampton to Dorchester via Ringwood. It then skirted Poole Harbour to reach this spacious terminus at Bournemouth West, 71 miles from Bath and 45 from Evercreech Junction. Bournemouth West was better known as the terminus for Waterloo expresses. The S&D was long regarded as the poor relation. In 1965, the terminus closed completely. Its trains diverted to Bournemouth Central. The closure of this rural route followed the usual pattern of a lengthy public inquiry with many objections to the proposed withdrawal of services. But the outcome was in reality a foregone conclusion. The Labour government of the day were determined to cut losses on the then nationalised railway. Saturday the 5th of March 1966 was the last day of the S&D, with normal service trains and specials bursting to the seams in the glorious spring sunshine. Sadly, the closure would have scarcely been noticed by many people in the towns and villages along its route, rural buses and private cars long since having become their usual means of transport. This rural line to Lewes in Sussex closed in 1958, actually well before the publication of the Beeching Report, but incredibly reopened as the Bluebell Railway only 2 years later to become the first standard gauge heritage railway in the country. Its northern terminus at Horsted Keynes was still used by BR trains from Haywards Heath until the closure of that line in 1963. The Bluebell Railway was then free to take over the spacious 5-platform station and restore it to look much as it would have done in Southern Railway days. Among the railway's first locomotives were 2 Terrier tanks, originally built for suburban duties. The other end of the reopened Bluebell Railway was Sheffield Park, originally just an intermediate station on the line to Lewes. The Bluebell Railway set up its locomotive headquarters here, as well as administrative offices, a museum and bookshop, all essential ingredients of a successful preserved railway. The Bluebell Railway quickly became far more popular than its founders could have imagined. By the early 1970s, it was welcoming 250,000 visitors a year. Today, visitors to the Bluebell Railway can enjoy a ride not only on the original 5-mile stretch between Sheffield Park and Horsted Keynes, but also on the 3-mile extension northwards to Kingscote. This extension opened in stages between 1990 and 1994, a testimony to the patience and hard work of hundreds of volunteers over the previous 35 years. The eventual aim is to extend beyond Kingscote to the outskirts of East Grinstead, with a new terminus in the old station goods yard, within walking distance of the Network rail station in the town. The Bluebell Railway traveller sees rural England at its best, as the train threads its way through an attractive patchwork of fields and woods. Like many other preserved or heritage lines, the Bluebell thrives as much on its location as on its historic collection of locomotives and rolling stock. The stations too are an all-important part of the nostalgic experience. Manually operated semaphore signals guard the exit from Horsted Keynes Station, much as they would have done in early BR days. However, it's doubtful whether BR could ever have kept the station facilities quite as spick and span as this. One day, it's possible that Horsted Keynes Station may become a junction again, with the Bluebell Railway intending to relay the branch towards Haywards Heath that closed in 1963. However, this project is best regarded as a long-term aspiration. Today's motive power on the Bluebell Railway is a lot more varied than it would have been in BR days. The railway hosts the UK's largest and most comprehensive collection of ex-Southern Railway types, including this S15, owned by the Maunsell Locomotive Society. Being the first major heritage line to operate, the Bluebell had the incredible advantage that some of the locomotives used were acquired straight from BR service into preservation. After 1968, the railway had to look mainly to the scrapyards, and heavy restoration work became one of its main activities. If it hadn't been for the unpaid work put in by generations of volunteers, most of this wonderful line would now be returned to nature, just like the Somerset and Dorset route. Today, the Bluebell undoubtedly succeeds in recreating a bygone age, to be enjoyed as much by those born after 1968 as by those for whom it all seems like yesterday. The border city of Carlisle is still an important railway junction today, but until 1969 it was also the starting point for a line which some say should never have closed, the Waverley line to Edinburgh via Hawick and Galashiels. Completed in 1862 by the North British Railway Company, the Waverley line provided the most direct route between Carlisle and the Scottish capital, competing with the Caledonian Railway route via Carstairs. The Waverley line also gave access to a number of branch lines. Riddings Junction, 14 miles north of Carlisle, was the starting point for the 7 miles long branch to Langholm. That branch was never fully dieselised and was an early casualty of the Beeching Report, closing to passengers in 1964. However, it kept a residual pickup goods service until 1967. Hawick marks the halfway point between Carlisle and Edinburgh, and was one of only two sizable towns on the Waverley Line, the other being Galashiels. While diesels were beginning to take over on the west and east coast main lines, this secondary line wasn't a priority for modernisation. In 1961, the line was still host to this J37 goods engine, built around the time of the First World War. An even older type still in daily use was this J36, a North British design dating back to 1888. Long before the advent of the UK motorway network, the Waverley Line saw a wide variety of through traffic, including express goods trains between northwest England and the east of Scotland, which often conveyed perishables and other time-sensitive traffics. The North British company that built the Waverley Line was absorbed into the LNER in 1923, and LNER-built locomotives like this B1 remained a common sight on the line even into BR days. The ancient locomotive that was still based at St Boswell's for working the long branch to Berwick via Kelso was paired with a couple of elderly non-corridor carriages, although there were only a handful of passengers to enjoy the ride. Ever since the Waverley Line closed in January 1969, there have been proposals to reopen it, especially the northern section between Galashiels and Edinburgh. In March 2005, the Scottish Executive agreed in principle to fund the reopening of the line as far as Tweedbank, just beyond Galashiels and 35 miles from Edinburgh. The Scottish Parliament was due to debate the proposals in the summer, and all being well, construction could begin in 2006. If trains do return once more to Galashiels, this will be the most ambitious railway reopening project ever undertaken in the UK. A once important Transpennine route that closed in 1962 was the Stainmore Line, linking Tebay and Penrith in the west with Darlington in the east. Although built mainly for mineral traffic, especially coke from the Durham coalfield to the ironworks of Furness, in BR days the line was at its busiest on summer Saturdays, with scheduled holiday trains running between Blackpool and either Newcastle or South Shields. The trackbed of this stretch of the line near Ravenstonedale is now the main A685 road. Trains were commonly double-headed in order to tackle the gradients of up to 1 in 59 between Kirkby Stephen and Stainmore Summit. Ravenstonedale station had already been closed to passengers for nearly a decade, when the very last train over Stainmore passed through in January 1962. The Stainmore line was known for its heavy engineering works, including Smaردale Viaduct, which was some 550 feet long and up to 90 feet high. Although most of the costs associated with running a railway cease when the line closes, some, like the maintenance of listed major structures, still continue. Although the isolated Smaردale Viaduct hadn't carried any revenue-earning traffic for 40 years, it still had to be maintained by BR and then Railtrack. Eventually, this impressive structure was sold for just a penny and restored by the Northern Viaducts Trust, and today forms part of a pleasant country footpath. Heading towards Kirkby Stephen, the Stainmore line passed through an arch of the other Smaردale Viaduct on the Settle and Carlisle line, just visible in the distance. Kirkby Stephen East was the junction for the Eden Valley branch to Appleby and Penrith, part of which survived for freight traffic until the 1980s. The track between Appleby and Warcop was never lifted, and the reopening of that section was the first target of the Eden Valley Railway Society, formed in 1995. The site of Kirkby Stephen East Station was also saved, and in the longer term, the Eden Valley Railway Society aims to restore a train service on the 11-mile stretch from Appleby to Kirkby Stephen. Beelagh Viaduct was without doubt the most famous engineering structure on the Stainmore line. Spanning a distance of over 1,000 feet and standing 196 feet above the valley floor, it was built entirely of iron, designed to combine strength with lightweight construction. Today there's barely a trace of the railway at Beelagh. The viaduct was dismantled and cut up for scrap soon after the line closed in 1962, leaving only memories of the holiday trains that once clattered across the valley. The nearby Settle and Carlisle line has a happier story to tell. It was one of the handful of trunk routes targeted for closure in the 1963 Beeching Report and was threatened again in the 1970s and 80s. However, the line that refused to die has since bounced back to become a major freight artery, as well as providing much-needed passenger services in the Yorkshire Dales National Park. With its substantial viaducts, numerous tunnels and other heavy engineering works, the Settle and Carlisle line was a magnificent achievement by the Midland Railway when it first opened to passengers in 1876. But a century later, British Rail was trying its best to run down the residual intercity service, claiming that it was a hopeless loss-maker. In 1983, the line was deprived of all its through freight traffic. Typically, very little effort was made to market the few passenger services that remained. In the 1980s, Batty Moss or Ribblehead Viaduct came to symbolise the struggle to save the S&C. Its deteriorating condition was given as a compelling reason for closing the line, with an estimated repair bill in 1988 of nearly £3 million. The 24-span structure rises majestically above the moorland landscape that was once inhabited by hundreds of navvies employed by the Midland Railway. Today, small humps and depressions on the ground are all that remain of the navvy settlements, with their shops, schools and other facilities. Mechanical signalling has remained a feature of the Settle and Carlisle line to the present day, although some boxes, such as this one at Horton, were abolished in the 1980s as traffic levels declined. Horton was one of the 12 intermediate stations that closed in 1970, when BR withdrew the twice-daily local passenger service between Skipton and Carlisle. Happily, the platforms were left in position, as the closure turned out to be short-lived. The Yorkshire Dales National Park sponsored a summertime Dales Rail service from 1975, and BR reintroduced all year-round stopping trains in 1986. Today, 8 of the 12 closed stations are in the timetable again. In the late 1980s, it seemed that the writing was firmly on the wall, as the official closure notices were posted, and there was a flurry of steam specials to travel the route for the last time. Helped by the publicity generated by the many steam train specials, the fight to save the line began to gain momentum. At the same time, British Rail began a campaign of closure by stealth, gradually cutting back on all but the most essential maintenance and grossly exaggerating the cost of the line's upkeep. In the end, after a huge public outcry and against all the odds, the potential of this fine line was finally acknowledged in 1989 by the Conservative government of the day, who scrapped the closure plan, opening the way for the line to be revitalised. After the closure notices were withdrawn, Ribblehead Viaduct was repaired and the track singled to restrict weight, although the final bill was nowhere near the claimed original estimate of £3 million. The S&C has rediscovered its freight potential, although the freight flows that use the line today are very different from those that finished in 1983. The main traffic now is coal from Scottish opencast sites and Hunterston Deepwater Port to power stations in the Ayr and Trent valleys. In the early 1980s, the coal travelled mainly in the other direction, from Yorkshire pits to customers in Scotland. Unseen by most tourists, the line also carries up to 3 chains a day of containerised desulfur gypsum from Drax Power Station near Selby to Kirby Thorne, keeping hundreds of lorries off the narrow Yorkshire Dales roads. Much of the credit for the revival of the S&C goes to the voluntary group Friends of the Settle Carlisle Line, that was formed in 1981 to campaign against BR's closure plans. Shortly after the reprieve, the charitable Settle Carlisle Railway Trust was founded, with the aim of conserving the historic architecture and structures along the route. Today, these organisations work hand in hand with the different train operating companies and local councils to promote the line and ensure its continued success. The work of the Settle Carlisle Railway Trust in restoring Horton and Kirby Stevens stations was not only welcomed by the travelling public, but also gained royal approval when the Prince of Wales arrived behind Duchess of Sutherland in March 2005.
I just wanted to use this opportunity to congratulate all those who played such an enormously important part in keeping this line open and in restoring these wonderful buildings and in making it such a pleasure for people to travel along this line, in which I include myself, having had the great good fortune of going along here already today, being pulled by a steam engine, which I can't tell you what pleasure it gives me. It brings back very happy memories of my childhood. So thank God for enthusiasts like all of you, if I may say so, because the world would be very much a poorer place. Well done, Mr. Evelyn, and I'm delighted to unveil this plaque. Thank you.
But the S&C is much more than a working museum. Thanks to strong public support, the line that refused to die is now once again an integral part of the nation's freight and passenger rail network, and as such can look forward to a bright future. A less fortunate Transpennine route was the Woodhead line, which, despite being spared by Dr. Beeching, lost its through passenger service in 1970 and closed completely in 1981. Sheffield Victoria Station lay on the former Great Central route from Manchester to London, but in later years it was best known as the terminus of the electrically worked service from Manchester, hauled by Class 76 locomotives of LNER design. pioneering Woodhead electrification scheme was the first of its kind in the country, linking two major cities some 41 miles apart, and including a brand new tunnel through the Pennines. Work on the scheme was started by the LNER, but delayed by the Second World War. The full electric service from Manchester to Sheffield eventually being launched in 1954. Locomotive changes were a feature of Woodhead operations, as many trains began or ended their journey away from the electrified line. Penistone was the junction for the non-electrified branch to Barnsley, which lost its local passenger service in 1959, but was still used by excursion traffic in the 1960s. Although the Woodhead line had seen massive investment in the 1950s, the chosen electrification system of 1,500 volts DC soon became non-standard, as BR opted instead for 25 kilovolts AC for its West Coast scheme. The low level of business from most intermediate stations meant that BR could reroute its Manchester-Sheffield trains via the Hope Valley line without too much opposition. Local services would continue at each end of the Woodhead line, electric between Manchester and Hadfield, and diesel between Penistone and Sheffield. But the rerouting would bring the end of passenger services through the new Woodhead Tunnel, barely 15 years old. What a waste. Freight traffic continued to keep Woodhead busy in the 1970s, mainly coal from Yorkshire pits to various destinations in the northwest, including Fiddler's Ferry Power Station and Garston Docks for export. It's tempting today to think that the Woodhead route should have remained open, but the reality is that the traffic has changed dramatically, and most people now travel across the Pennines by car on the A57. Woodhead coal traffic ebbed away as the Yorkshire pits closed, and the 1950s electrification system was old and expensive to maintain. BR decided that the best option was to reroute the remaining trains and close the central part of the line completely, which they did in July 1981. By the end of the Second World War, the privately run railway network was totally worn out and in desperate need of new investment. The new Labour government of 1945 believed the answer was to nationalise not just the railways, but all the nation's transport, including lorries. Some 6 years later, the new Conservative government decided to denationalise the road industry, but left British Railways intact. As competition between road and rail dramatically increased, the losses began to mount up. British Railways were forced to charge freight customers a set tariff, which was set down by a parliamentary tribunal. In practice, these charges could easily be undercut by the new private road hauliers. The rot quickly set in, and more traffic moved from rail to road. Over the years, as the motorway network has steadily expanded, many freight services and rural freight-only lines have been lost. Thankfully, some rural freight-only lines were left intact, and today the Amlook branch, which closed to freight traffic in the 1990s, could well be reopened as a passenger line once again. For the isolated routes that served the many coal mines that once were scattered around the countryside, the future was decidedly bleak. With no traffic and no potential for passengers, nearly all of these lines have been lifted and are returning to nature. It's important to be realistic though, and to realise that not every line that's closed can have a new future as a preserved railway, or be reopened as a cycleway. The Great Central Main Line, from Sheffield to Nottingham and London, was a prime target for closure because it largely duplicated other routes. Daytime expresses were withdrawn from the Great Central as early as 1961, leaving only semi-fast traffic and one cross-country service between York and Bournemouth. Through freight traffic was withdrawn in 1965, and long sections of the route were closed completely in the following year, leaving just a rather pathetic DMU-operated service between Nottingham and Rugby until 1969. The Great Central's London extension from Nottingham to London Marylebone was Britain's last main line, opening in 1899. Although it was superbly engineered, it served fewer population centres than rival routes, and south of Rugby it ran through 60 miles of almost uninterrupted farmland. Here, at Loughborough, it passed over the Midland Main Line, though there was no physical connection between the two routes in the steam days. One of the main freight flows on the Great Central was coal from the East Midlands to London, routed via marshalling yards at Annesley and Woodford Hulse. As a prelude to closure, BR was able to divert much of this traffic onto the Midland Main Line. A limited revival for the Great Central came in the 1970s, thanks to the Mainline Steam Trust, a voluntary group that aimed to recreate the experience of mainline steam running by reviving the 9-mile stretch between Loughborough and Leicester. The operation later took the name of its ancestor, the Great Central Railway. Loughborough Central Station has been painstakingly restored to recall the post-war years before the decline of the railway set in. Uniquely among Britain's preserved railways, the Great Central includes some 5.5 miles of double track, which in itself goes a long way towards creating a mainline feel. However, the regulations for heritage railways prevent today's trains from attaining mainline speeds. This particular train is hauled appropriately by a former Great Central 04 locomotive. This peak diesel recalls a more recent era, but one that must be just as unfamiliar to younger observers as the age of steam. The peaks remained a common sight on nearby Midland lines in Leicestershire until the mid-1980s. We step back into the 1930s at Quorn, where the nameboard reminds us that the Great Central became part of the LNER in 1923. The line remained under Eastern Region control in early BR days, but was later transferred to the London Midland region. The island platform at Quorn was a typical Great Central arrangement. The semaphore signals, box and sidings all enhance the authentic mainline atmosphere of the Great Central. For the time being, trains are limited to the 9 miles from Loughborough to Leicester North, but longer-term plans could see the line extended north from Loughborough to Ruddington, giving a total route length of nearly 20 miles. The main stumbling block to that extension is the missing bridge over the Midland Main Line at Loughborough. Had BR not run down the Great Central in the 60s, peaks might well have become established on passenger and freight duties until the arrival of second-generation diesel traction in the 80s and 90s. The Great Central had the advantage of gentle gradients, nothing steeper than 1 in 176, and wide radius curves, making it highly suitable for high-speed running. Whether the small intermediate stations like Rothley could have survived into the 21st century in national ownership is another matter. At best, the buildings would doubtless have been demolished, and the station reduced to an unstaffed halt. In reality, BR closed Rothley and 5 other intermediate stations between Nottingham and Rugby as early as 1963, though thankfully some platforms and buildings were left intact. Although a return to trunk mainline status is possible, if ever the Central Railway's Channel Tunnel piggyback link plans come to fruition, the most likely prospect for this surviving chunk of the Great Central is its continued development as a thriving heritage line. Perhaps the major asset that all of the UK's heritage lines share is the widespread use of volunteers. From drivers to station staff and track maintenance gangs, most people don't draw any wages. They're happy to give up their time for something they believe so passionately about. However, for today's lines that are at risk of closure, it's a very different story. A threatened rural line that still forms part of the national network today is the 114-mile route around the Cumbrian coast. Dr. Beeching proposed closing the central part of the route completely and retaining just branch lines from Carnforth to Barrow and from Carlisle to Whitehaven. Despite the line offering some of the most impressive coastal scenery in Britain, the route is only lightly used by local traffic. At Arnside, the Cumbrian Fells form an inviting backdrop as a diesel unit crosses the Kent estuary. A single carriage, somewhat dwarfed by its surroundings, provides more than adequate accommodation for the few passengers travelling between Barrow and Whitehaven. Dalston Station, like almost all intermediate stations on the Cumbrian coastline, became an unstaffed halt around 1970 as BR tried to cut costs. Unusually for such a rural location, part of the former goods yard remains in use for deliveries of oil from Grangemouth Refinery. The only Network Rail line to penetrate into the Central Lake District is the threatened 10-mile Windermere branch, The line was built mainly with tourism in mind, although it was opposed by no less a person than William Wordsworth. The Windermere branch was always single track, but severe rationalisation came in the early 1970s when BR removed all loops and sidings, effectively turning the branch into a long siding from the West Coast mainline junction at Oxenholme. Unfortunately, this rationalisation meant that the branch was barred to through excursion locomotive haul trains. The old terminus at Windermere became more of a liability than an asset, and BR decided in 1980 to sell off the site for conversion to a supermarket, with provision for a new terminal platform behind. Today, there's little effort made to promote this attractive line, which would surely support a regular summer steam service. In mid-Wales, the survival of the Cambrian coastline from Machynlleth to Pwllheli owes much to political expediency. A survey in 1974, when car ownership was significantly less than it is today, found that less than 2% of Merioneth residents used the line, and only 3% of visiting tourists used it. But for some communities, it undeniably fulfilled a role, and each closure proposal was greeted with vehement opposition. The 115-span Barmouth Bridge crossing the Mordack estuary caused the most recent threat to the line when it was found to be infested by marine woodworms. Many feared the worst, but in fact repairs were carried out and the line was soon back in business. In the late 1980s, the Cambrian coast was one of several rural routes to benefit from radio signalling, cutting out the need for traditional signal boxes. In Cornwall, the Looe branch is one of several to have survived against all the odds. A single railcar shuttles between the picturesque coastal town of Looe and the main line junction at Liskeard. Rationalisation came early to the Looe branch. The passenger service was dieselised in 1961, and goods facilities were withdrawn in 1963, leaving just a basic long-siding operation. An even more curious survival is the Gunnislake branch on the Devon-Cornwall border. This was the classic case of a line being retained for social reasons, and because there was no realistic road alternative. As one writer put it, BR had suffered the misfortune of inheriting a fine viaduct across the River Tamar. In historical terms, the Gunnislake branch was once two separate lines, joined here at Bir Alston, where today's trains reverse direction. Although only one track remains, Bir Alston Station has so far managed to escape bus shelter treatment and retain something of its London and South Western Railway character. Even the shell of the signal box remains on the former up platform. Until 1968, Bir Alston was an intermediate station on the London and South Western Main Line from Exeter to Plymouth, and the junction for branch trains to Callington via Gunnislake. Through services on the London and South Western Main Line were withdrawn because they were supposedly duplicating those on the Great Western route via Dawlish. In practice, the logic of the closure was questionable, as it left the sizable town of Tavistock without a rail service, and forced all the costs of the surviving Bir Alston to Plymouth line onto the Gunnislake branch operation. Hopefully, scenes like this on the Ingleton branch, which once linked Clapham on the Skipton to Lancaster line with Lowgill on the West Coast Main Line, will not be repeated again. Track lifting here didn't take place until 1967, the line having been retained as a theoretical diversionary route for West Coast expresses. In practice, the track lifting trains were the heaviest loads the line had seen for some time. In reality, no government will go on subsidising little-used routes with trains which are seen as doing little more than carting fresh air around the countryside. But with car ownership, particularly in rural areas, considered to be a necessity, our rural lines need very skillful marketing if they are to survive. No doubt, new action groups, inspired by the success of the Friends of the Settle and Carlisle, will begin themselves to promote their own local lines, not just as passenger routes, but also for their valuable freight potential, keeping lorries off our overcrowded roads. Surely everyone in the community will stand to benefit from a sensibly funded and used rural railway network.